You're watching Going Underground. I'm Afshin Rattansi. Coming up in today's show, with Islamist groups until recently supported by our government capturing new territory in Syria, we look at David Cameron playing fast and loose with the British public about the war against President Bashar al-Assad. And with Britain in the dock at the European Court of Human Rights over horrific torture allegations, we speak to the former Director of Intelligence of the IRA. All this and more on today's Going Underground. Labour has slammed the coalition government for failing to help Syrian refugees seek asylum. Home Office Minister James Brokenshire's response: the UK's focus is on ending the fighting and providing humanitarian aid in the region. So, despite backing out of invading the country, has the UK found a backdoor method of getting involved on the ground? Award-winning author and journalist Reese Erlich's new book, Inside Syria, the backstory of their civil war and what the world can expect, traces the history of the embattled nation and examines attempts at regime change. He joins me now via Skype from Oakland, California. Reese, welcome to Going Underground. Let's start about the book itself and how, in a sense, Britain helped stop the democratic movements trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in a way.
Well, in my view, the original movements that included civil society activists and conservative but not extremist Islamist parties had a lot of popular support in Syria in roughly the first year of the uprising. When the Bashar al-Assad government cracked down, the response was to turn to armed struggle, and of course Britain, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and others got involved, arming groups and making a political settlement all the more difficult.
Even though, of course, our British government denies that.
Of course, they deny all kinds of things, but that doesn't make it true.
And so how quickly have we gone from the Queen meeting President Assad here at Buckingham Palace, and there we were secretly, in effect, arming militant rebels that would become ultra-conservatives, as you put it?
Well, I think for a long time, both the British, American, and the Israeli governments saw Assad as the devil they knew. That is, he was a stable, secular dictator who kept the border with Israel quiet despite all his anti-Israeli rhetoric. And so the outside powers were reluctant initially to see him go. But as the uprising continued, as the struggle intensified, they decided, well, he's going to be out soon, so we'll call for his overthrow and change policies. But of course, that hasn't worked, and he's been in power, well, basically he's continued now for 3+ years.
Your book details perhaps the most, it is the most detailed expose of the events surrounding the chemical attack in southeastern Damascus in Ghouta. Do you think after all that work you did, looking at all the different sides as regards that, a chemical attack, that David Cameron sexed up the information about the chemical attack to persuade Britain into war?
I think there's no question that both the U.S. and Britain exaggerated the claims in order to justify an attack. This was in August of last year, of course. What I write in my book is that in the earlier attacks in March, it's perfectly possible that rebel extremists such as al-Nusra or the Islamic State had used a small amount of chemical weapons, including sarin, against the Assad troops. Who was responsible for the big attack in August of last year in Ghouta remains up for grabs. There's evidence that points both ways.
We received information here after Carla Del Ponte expressed some doubts, the United Nations person on the ground. What happened to her? In the immediate aftermath, we had character assassination here in the media. What happened to her casting any doubts on the attack?
Remember, this was what she was doubting was the first attacks in March. In smaller numbers, it was near Aleppo. She gave an interview to a Swiss TV station in which she said the rebels did it. And that was so controversial that she was told basically to shut up and no longer made comments. But the information that she was basing her conclusions on is available and appears in my book.
And it's one thing for Prime Minister Cameron, for Obama, President Obama to be changing the information to persuade their nations into war. What about trying to hide attacks? Because you say in the book that Turkey failed to prosecute an al-Nusra possible attack on a U.S. Air Force base.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, the degrees to which things will be covered up when they're embarrassing. What happened was some al-Nusra operatives were arrested both in Iraq and in Turkey in possession of precursors of chemical weapons. But the fact that it was rebels rather than the Assad regime that was caught meant that the issue was hushed up. So the people who had sarin or precursors for sarin were arrested in Turkey. The initial news reports indicated that they were never prosecuted for chemical weapons. They were prosecuted for other issues. But you'd think that if somebody was planning to attack a U.S. air base, there'd be a bigger deal about it. But the whole issue was quietly disposed of.
But just in the past few days, Prime Minister Cameron still believes that British foreign policy has a role to play in helping ordinary Syrians. Is that just nonsense?
Well, if the help was limited to aid, humanitarian aid, helping the refugees in surrounding countries, helping the displaced people inside Syria, that would be one thing. But I don't believe Prime Minister Cameron any more than I believe President Bush when it comes to their protestations in support of the people of Syria.
You make it clear that Syria is not a great oil power in the region. Why do you think Britain wanted to get involved in this way?
It's all about location. The nearby countries have lots of oil, Iraq particularly, Iran not too far away. Syria has a border with Israel and Turkey and Jordan. It's been a strong ally of Iran. It's been supportive of Hezbollah, and until the uprising began, a supporter of Hamas. And so whoever has power in Damascus has a lot of influence on the region, and I think it's geopolitics.
Very little mention of Syria in the latest Senate Intelligence Committee report into CIA torture. Did that surprise you? In fact, no mention at all.
It didn't surprise me because, ironically, Syria, the government of Bashar al-Assad, had cooperated with the U.S. in the early days of the so-called War on Terror. There was a Canadian citizen who was illegally kidnapped out of Kennedy Airport with the connivance of the Canadian Royal Mounted Police. He was shipped off to Syria, where he was tortured for a year. The guy turned out to be totally innocent. The Canadian and American information was wrong. And Assad held that up as an example of cooperation between the U.S. and the Syrian government, and numerous other examples of helping in the war on terror. But it's the kind of help that the U.S. isn't real happy about publicizing.
So is it just that intelligence agencies at the CIA or here at intelligence agencies at MI6, they just have short memories? Because you make the point that a U.S. diplomat you talked to, Henry Precht, said that actually intelligence agents are no more informed than someone with a cursory understanding of the New York Times.
Well, that argument in that interview was in the context of the idea that there's all this super secret information that the public can't see in order, and that's the reason that we go into war, and you have to trust the intelligence agencies. And what he pointed out is that a good reporter on the ground with good contacts can often get more information than the CIA can. Not always, but in many cases. And so we see it now with all this justification of torture coming out of the U.S. and Britain. In reality, the activities that the U.S. engaged in were not necessary. They obviously exaggerated and made up the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and we're seeing it again now with what I call Iraq War #3, where supposedly the Islamic State is such a huge threat that we have to send in thousands of troops and ultimately combat troops to fight them.
So in a sense, we did get involved in a war over there in any case. But when it comes to governments trying to change information about red lines, do you think the failure over getting Congress or getting the British Parliament to vote for war means that we won't have any of this problem in the future?
Well, I guess I wish that were the case. And I was actually optimistic last year when the British Parliament took the lead and voted against going to war with Assad over the chemical weapons issue. And the U.S. Followed suit. The popular opinion was overwhelmingly against it. But now, since the attacks by the Islamic State, the beheadings of both American and British nationals, popular opinion has shifted back again. I don't think it's going to stay there. But those were horrific attacks. The Islamic State is a horrific group. And ironically, the U.S. and British efforts to attack them actually help them. It means that they're now seen as an international group that can recruit. They were a local group carrying out awful actions. And the impact of the bombing and the escalation of the troops is going to be to help the Islamic State at a time when the local people are capable of fighting against them given some time.
Reese Erlich, thank you.
Thank you.
We don't hear much about the British connection when it comes to Chelsea Manning, who celebrates her 27th birthday in a prison in Kansas today. The whistleblower who used WikiLeaks to tell the world about US war crimes is for some reason an American story, even though she grew up with her Welsh mum in Wales for a time. The lack of a UK angle means there's less pressure on David Cameron to tell President Obama that we want Manning back. In fact, what has the government done to reward revelations of indiscriminate Allied killing in Iraq and Afghanistan? It spent tens of millions of taxpayers' money on keeping Manning's chosen publisher, WikiLeaks, in virtual house arrest in London. It's detained the partner of Glenn Greenwald, who wrote up the Edward Snowden revelations at Heathrow Airport. It's attacked lawyers representing those alleging British torture. And look at the anger of the regulator of Britain's secret services, Sir Malcolm Rifkind, when challenged on mainstream media about the Snowden revelations.
Your programme is constantly suggesting that GCHQ might be circumventing British law. You haven't even examined the law.
Maybe the law allows mass surveillance by GCHQ. Maybe it allowed UK soldiers to torture people in Iraq. But does that make it right? And why are we again sending hundreds of British soldiers back into Iraq in the next few weeks, with still no sign of the Chilcot inquiry into our last war there? Coming up in part 2 of Going Underground, is the CIA merely copying torture techniques used by Labour and Tory governments? And was yesterday's horrific attack on an army school in Peshawar blowback for Britain's actions in Afghanistan and Pakistan? All this and more after the break. Exactly a year to the day of yesterday's Peshawar massacre, David Cameron said this about our campaign against the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Our troops can leave with their heads held high, a job well done.
But just how well done was evident when an offshoot of the Taliban we were supposed to have defeated managed to attack a school in neighbouring nuclear-armed Pakistan. Hundreds of children were wounded or killed, some of them as young as 5 in Peshawar. David Cameron condemned the attack on Twitter, saying the news from Pakistan is deeply shocking. It's horrifying that children are being killed simply for going to school. But this was nothing to do with children going to school. This was something to do with children going to an army school. The perpetrators, Tehreek-e-Taliban, were de facto created by Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI, as well as, of course, the CIA. The politics of the Taliban movement, created over 30 years ago, mean that anyone connected to an opposing faction, such as the Pakistani army, is a fair target. And while our politicians and the British mainstream media roundly condemn terrorist attacks as an assault by Islamist militants against all non-Muslims, they're less keen to point out that these hundreds of victims of the Taliban are in fact Muslim themselves. Could it be that they don't want the British people to figure out that it's our foreign policy and our drone attacks that are the reason hundreds of children are now dead and wounded? The US government cited the 1978 Hooded Man case, in which 14 Catholic men were subjected to beating, sleep deprivation, and exposure to white noise as justification for methods used in the US Senate CIA torture report. With us via Skype from Dublin is solicitor Kieran Conway. He's a former director of intelligence of the IRA, and he's just published Southside Provisional: From Freedom to the Four Courts, which details just some of the British techniques that are still echoed in the CIA report. Welcome to Going Underground, Kieran. So mainstream media suddenly discovering UK complicity in torture. Do you recognise the techniques in the US Senate report when it comes to torture by British troops?
I do. Well, the only sophisticated version was that of the so-called hooded men, which is to be reopened before the European Court of Human Rights. And that's a very, very necessary move, because at least it will change the existing law on what constitutes torture and disable any future attempt to use that judgment to justify the sort of stuff that the US did at Guantanamo and in other places.
And what sort of torture? You detail some of it in the book. Are we talking about, because the book even talks about the raping of Catholics and as well as murder, but here we're talking very much about British soldiers, throwing people out of helicopters.
Yes, that sort of thing. That was at the less sophisticated scale, if you like. That was the fists and boots element in torture, which was extremely common. The majority of the people I was in prison with were subjected to such forms of torture, or ill treatment, as the European Court decided to call it at the time. But there were a group of men who were carefully selected on a geographical basis for special treatment over an extended period. They were forced to remain in a standing position. White noise was streamed. They were deprived of food, drink. There were various other, they were hooded, of course, throughout, supposedly to avoid them recognizing each other, which is all nonsense. And they were very disorientated, and most of them suffered lasting damage as a result of that treatment back in 1971.
The big question, of course, in American media has been whether torture, while of course being illegal under the Geneva Conventions, worked. When you were at the IRA, did torture work? Because you did say that it created widespread paranoia.
Mm-hmm. Well, up to a point it did. Ill treatment, it's a matter of historic fact that more so in the later 1970s, confessions were beaten out of suspects, and they were then convicted before special courts on the basis of the signed confessions that they had made.
And those were true confessions. You sound like Dick Cheney for a second.
Well, no. Some are true, some are false. I mean, if you're being ill-treated to that extent, I believe that you're capable of signing whatever's put in front of you.
Now, onto the book itself. Why did you decide to write it in the first place?
I was coming up to my 60th birthday. My son knew nothing of my past. He had a similar upbringing to myself in South County Dublin, middle-class, privileged upbringing. And I wanted him to know something of his father. Not just him, my wife knew very little about me. She knew I had been in the IRA, of course, but beyond that, we didn't really talk about it very much. And I wanted to leave some sort of record of my existence on this earth.
There's no great love of the South, of course, but why do you think in Britain we don't really understand the huge spectrum of views that members of the IRA had while they were bombing British cities and killing British soldiers?
Perhaps our own publicity machine was remiss. It's commonly misunderstood that the IRA did its utmost to avoid civilian casualties. They did occur. When I first joined, it never crossed my mind that we might kill an innocent civilian, but that very, very quickly became the norm, unfortunately. When bombs were put out in civilian places, warnings were supposed to be given that would be of sufficient length to allow the area to be cleared by the police. That didn't always happen. A great many errors and mistakes can be put down, in my view, to what Nelson Mandela called the fallibility of the combatant. What I mean by that is that people made mistakes. We had very, very young volunteers in a lot of cases. And while they did get training, I myself got 4 weeks training before I became active. clearly they weren't trained to the level of professional soldiers, and they did make mistakes.
But of course, you said that the Birmingham pub bombings were a disaster, both obviously for the innocent civilians that died and for IRA policy more generally.
Yes, they were. In anticipation of being asked about the Birmingham bombs, I took a look at Wikipedia and it reminded me of a number of things that happened. Firstly, it reminded me that the IRA at the time said clearly that none of the Birmingham Six were members of the IRA. And Dave O'Connell, who was then chairman of the Army Council and effectively the leader of the IRA, said in an interview or in a statement, I'm not sure which, that the people involved would be subjected to, first of all, to an internal inquiry, and should that prove necessary, to a court-martial, and they could be shot. They could be shot dead if they were found to have done it, for instance, deliberately.
We've long since known about American collusion with what would become the Taliban and a myriad other Islamist groups. Just tell me a little bit about the collusion that went on in Ireland as regards the army, the security services, and the Ulster paramilitaries.
Well, the UDA and the UVF were infiltrated by the British from the start. It's quite easy for them to do. I believe that they were manipulated by them. I believe that the British were responsible for incidents like the Dublin bombings, which remains the single greatest atrocity of the Troubles.
And Monaghan, of course, you mentioned.
Monaghan, the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, excuse me, you're quite right. And also for the sectarian murder of Catholics, with a view to provoking the IRA into a response so that the British could then portray themselves as peacekeepers between two sets of religious fanatics.
You also talk about Garda collusion, of course, in the Irish police.
Yes, well, collusion would not be my word. I mean, I would view the members of the Garda that gave us information as patriots, and I think they took great risks with their careers and with their lives to assist in what was, I believe, a justified struggle.
I suppose what people who maybe sympathize with the Republican cause, certainly the injustice of alleged torture, they might be surprised on reading your book to see how sanguine you are about the failure to create the kind of united Ireland you wanted to.
Yeah, well, it's 20 years on, so I'm a lot more sanguine than I was when I left the IRA in 1993. Yes, that's life. Things move on. And the position today is generally acceptable to most people. It's a settlement that was always available and is...
so the entire struggle, there was no point in it?
No, it was a complete, it was a futile and useless waste of lives. And the existing dispensation could have been achieved without the loss of a single drop of blood, and could have been achieved at any stage over the last 40 years. You
say most people. Why do you think that is? Obviously, there are splinter groups such as the Real IRA. Why, even after the huge economic crisis of Ireland, why is it acceptable to most people?
Because it brought peace, or at least an absence of violence, and I think that the majority of the population at any stage would have settled for that. And what about the troubles, as we hear, low-level troubles, as it were? We heard reports that in Belfast there are attempted terrorist attacks every other day. Yeah, they can't succeed. They don't have the capability and the military equipment that the provisionals had, and they're just causing suffering to their targets. And they are also causing suffering to their own volunteers. These young guys are getting slammed up for very, very lengthy periods with no prospect of release and no prospect of success. And they should lay down their arms and simply stop. And on the British torture cases, if Ireland succeeds at the European Court of Human Rights, do you think there will be other cases brought against the British government as regards torture? There have been a great many cases brought in the past. I think practically all of them have settled out of court. I think this particular case or this particular review, should it go to the European Court of Human Rights, and should the European Court of Human Rights revise its findings, will be historically important in, as I say, muddying the waters for any other state in the future to attempt to justify torture by reference to it. But my overall view on the Troubles, and I know this will not be popular with a lot of my former colleagues or with a lot of nationalists in the North, is that this is 21 years on now from the Downing Street Declaration, and the British government, who are the only people who can do this, rather than pursuing historic cases. You have Ivor Bell, charged with IRA membership way back in 1972. They need to draw a line under matters now and declare an amnesty. And the amnesty should apply to the British and to the British soldiers as much as to the IRA and the loyalists. In other words, the Bloody Sunday soldiers, the soldiers who committed murder in Derry on Bloody Sunday should also be entitled to avail of it.
Something that even Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness may not have said. You mention in the book, of course, just on the political element today, you were there in the campaign with Adams and McGuinness. Nowadays, you say in the book, you just shout at the television set.
Well, there's less reportage than there used to be, so I do less shouting, and my shouting would have been becoming less vocal as years went on.
But your opinion of Adams and McGuinness today?
I think they're mistaken and that they've misled the people. And I think that, for instance, Martin McGuinness, being Deputy First Minister in Stormont, does absolutely nothing for the nationalists that could not equally well have been done by the SDLP. In other words, all you have is a change of face.
Kieran Conway, thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for today's show, but we're back on Saturday when we speak to award-winning journalist and filmmaker John Pilger about the UK's record on torture. In the meantime, connect to us via Twitter, Facebook, SoundCloud and email, and don't forget RT UK News with Bill Dodd every weekday evening at 6, 8, 9 and 10. See you on Saturday.